Are you familiar with the Council on Foreign Relations War and Peace Studies project from 1939?
Not immediately familiar, but I have been in the past.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to go to the next question then. The Rockefeller family and their role in the League of Nations and the United Nations, and Columbia University, if you want.
Well, the Rockefellers had a deep association with all three. There were major benefactors to Columbia, major benefactors to starting the Council on Foreign Relations, the United Nations. I mean, they've been involved in just about everything in the last century that's plaguing us today, that's bothering us today. It wasn't surprising. Well, I'll tell you what was surprising. In that Technocracy was housed in Columbia University for a time, it is surprising that there was no institutional money coming from like the Rockefeller family or some of the other big families of the day, because that was right up their alley. Columbia was right up their alley. In fact, the competitor to Columbia University in the local scene in New York was called the New School, which is even more radical than Columbia. And between the two of them, they kind of had a lock on radicalism and institutional money. But they never got any money. Technocracy never got any money from these people at all. They just were passed over until the 70s, of course.
Who created the New School for Social Research?
You'll have to refresh my memory. I
thought it was Thorstein Veblen.
I do. I want to say Thorstein Veblen was the founder of the New School.
Sure.
And he was the father, of course, of Technocracy. Well, one of the fathers of Technocracy.
And there's a strong Fabian socialist influence through the New School.
Absolutely.
And I believe the New School for Social Research, which is based in New York City, it produced one of the 9/11 committee commissioners. I believe it was Bob Kerrey went to the New School.
The New School has been a hotbed of radicalism ever since it's founded.
What do you think its purpose is in this country?
Well, it was certainly to spread the ideas that the radical ideas that they had cooked up along the way. They did a very good job of it. They were the first university in America to establish a teachers' college, where they trained, I don't know how many tens of thousands of teachers around the country, and they sent them out to, they end up in universities and high schools, I mean, everywhere, where they learned the techniques of teaching progressivism at the New School. And in fact, the New School that wasn't originally, it was a New School for Social Research or something like that. It was a different name, and originally they dropped it later. But they had a profound influence on the educational community in America, and I think probably we see a lot of it still today. That influence just kind of overwhelmed the world of academia with radical ideas and stuff and radical teachers.
Sure. And John D. Rockefeller gave $1 million to the Columbia Teachers College, and there was a lot of money flowing into those ideas of control. There was a Columbia School of Journalism. Rockefeller Center was originally leased from Columbia University before they purchased it. What do you know about the Rockefellers' role in the creation of the United Nations?
Well, they gave the land upon which the UN sits. They donated tons of money and resources over the years to it. The United Nations, a few years ago anyway, gave a huge accolade to the Rockefellers for the instrumental work they did to make the UN a reality. So their fingerprints all over it. That's about all you can say. They've had a profound influence on it, and I fully expect that the payback for the Rockefeller influence at the United Nations was achieved when the Trilateral Commission turned to the United Nations to use them as a contagion factor for Agenda 21, for sustainable development, for, et cetera, et cetera. And they have been the contagion that spread this to every corner of the planet today. So, was it a good move on their part to start this in the first place? I think they probably knew it was going to be a good thing in the end. They just kept throwing money at it, kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger.
Well, I think part of the gambit was the creation of the League of Nations as a structure that was idealistic but was set up to fail. just so they could create the United Nations in a bigger, better, more proliferated form. I read your book Sunday, and on Saturday I just finished doing the introductory montage for my podcast, and I was looking for evidence in video and audio form that the Rockefellers helped create the United Nations. I found this tremendous piece with Boutros Boutros-Ghali giving this, and it's just like the official United Nations thank you to the Rockefeller family. And then the next day when I was reading through your book, you found a parallel path that proves the exact same thing from different evidence. And I was like, this is awesome. I finally, because people, they're like, the United Nations is philanthropic. They're there to help people, and it's really a United Nations. I'm like, no. The people that were running the world were seeking a better graphical user interface, a better front end, because what they're doing is really ugly. They have to use public relations and words and images and propaganda to make it look pretty. And then we have to do this to tell people what's going on.
Yeah, that's right.
What is meant by the United Nations use of the term interdependence?
This was a word or a phrase that was, as far as I know, was originally coined, or at least let's say popularized, by the Trilateral Commission in 1973. They used the word interdependence all over their literature. That was the flip side to their new international economic order pitch. Because of that, in order to implement that, we had to honor the interdependence that was developing amongst nations. I don't think there was any public demand for that back in those days.
So under capitalism, that idea would not have flown, but in the controlled market, it flies.
They kept repeating interdependence over and over again until people believed it as being true. And so academics started writing about it. People like Richard Gardner, early member of the Trilateral Commission, started writing about it, and others. And all of a sudden, the mantra was interdependence. Oh my gosh, we need to rush, hurry up and, control this whole process of going on interdependence. And there never really was any public demand for interdependence whatsoever. They just created it out of thin air. The United Nations picked it up, of course, and ran with it. And that has been one of the main instruments of interdependence, creating the system of interdependence, is through the United Nations. Even if most Americans would have thought, let's get the U.S. or get the United Nations out of the U.S. I remember those bumper stickers that were appeared a lot in the 70s and 80s. Most Americans didn't feel like the UN influenced America very much. But that wasn't true in other countries around the world. It was based here as viewed as more or less as a policy organ of the U.S., but it had a huge impact around the world on other countries and building the so-called system of interdependence. And I expect that they'll have their legacy in why countries in South America, for instance, hate the United States with a passion, because we meddled with them to the point where we either bankrupted them or whatever, did horrible things to them. And they generally hate America for it. That really shouldn't be that way. It shouldn't be they hate Americans, because you and I didn't do it. And I don't know any really true American that did it either, but it was just a relatively small group of people.
I could blame Nelson Rockefeller as, leading through Latin America, the South American policies. Yeah. Henry Kissinger.
That's right. Yep.
What do you know about the others? So the Trilateral Commission was, of course, created by Brzezinski and David Rockefeller. Nelson Rockefeller, his older brother, who had been vice president in the 70s, his protege was Kissinger. So Brzezinski and Kissinger are like the bookends to be able to, the vice grips to be able to squeeze in on America. How familiar are you with Nelson Rockefeller's history and the things, even though he's not officially in the Trilateral Commission, obviously they're brothers and they're running an agenda.
That's right.
So how do you see it fitting together?
They were very close, actually. Nelson always aspired to be a politician. I don't feel sorry for him that he had to be appointed to be vice president. But, the poor guy, he wanted to be a politician and he couldn't get elected anywhere. I don't know that David Rockefeller would have ever got elected anywhere either. Jay Rockefeller got elected in West Virginia. But Nelson was appointed to be vice president after Nixon resigned and Gerald Ford assumed the presidency. And so you had Beauty and the Beast kind of pairing with an unelected president and unelected vice president at the same time. More importantly is a question of why Nelson Rockefeller? Why would they want to get him in at that time? This was just after the Trilateral Commission had been founded in 1973. In my view and study of this, the most important thing that Nelson Rockefeller did is that he presided as president of the Senate as vice president. And the Senate in 1974 passed the first iteration of the Trade Promotion Authority Act, the Trade Act of 1974, that set up this so-called fast-track legislation method for trade treaties that would be negotiated by the executive branch, in particular the U.S. Trade Representative, the USTR, as is known. And that legislation got railroaded through by Nelson Rockefeller, and it was passed in the Senate, the first iteration of it, and it was given a life of its own. The Senate even still realized how dangerous fast track was, and they gave it a sunset clause so that it would automatically expire after a period of years. It has since been reauthorized multiple times. Right now, it is not authorized. Currently, the president is trying to get fast track reauthorized by the Senate and put into place so we can present the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Transatlantic Partnership as well, which is coming shortly. But Bill Clinton, through a great battle, was able to get fast-track authorization together for NAFTA and CAFTA later. And most of the nefarious treaties that have really done damage to our country have been passed under fast-track legislation. The key thing about fast-track is that it takes away, Congress, or the Senate in particular, delegated to the executive branch the ability to negotiate these treaties. Constitutionally speaking, it's the Senate's job to do that completely. They should be the ones negotiating treaties, and a treaty should only be passed with a 2/3 vote, 66% plus one. And what happens with fast track is that it gives the president the ability to present a treaty agreement for approval. It can have no amendments attached to it. In other words, they can't do a thing to it. They have to take it the way it is or reject it the way it is. There was only 20 hours of floor debate to be allowed, which is nothing. When you get the whole Senate together, 20 hours is just minuscule. And most importantly, it reduced the vote from a 2/3 vote down to 50%. So that's a shoo-in almost. So when NAFTA was presented, for instance, and it passed, before it passed the Senate vote, the Trilateral Commission pulled out all the big guns to hammerhead in the Senate on people to get them to vote for the treaty for NAFTA. And they had a hard time even getting 50%, 51%. They did, but they hauled out the Henry Kissingers of the world to go in and pound on them and tell them why they need this and, yada, yada. But NAFTA, just as a side note, was architected by Carla Hills, who was the USTR at the time. She was also a member of the Trilateral Commission. And for all intents and purposes, the North American Free Trade Agreement was a creation of trilateral policy, written by and architected by a member of the Trilateral Commission, signed first by George Bush, a member of the Trilateral Commission, pushed into law by Bill Clinton, a member of the Trilateral Commission, and lobbied by numerous members of the Trilateral Commission, including Jimmy Carter, George Bush, Henry Kissinger, and so on. It worked hand in glove with the work of Nelson Rockefeller from 1974. This was a key piece of legislation that they had to have in place, or they would never, ever have been able to pull off the economic coup that they pulled off in the last 40 years. Nelson did it.
So they brought him in. They brought him in as a specialized tool, and he did a certain job that opens up the doors for internationalism in the future.
That's right.
Public-private partnerships, CAFTA, NAFTA, these are all internationalist ideas. And it was his brother, I think, on page 505 that says, you guys accuse my family of being internationalists. He's like, we are. And he's like, get over it. This is the future. So these, again, it goes back to people who prophesy a future. It's a utopia that's run, benevolently by them. And you see these names come up over and over again through 20th century history. Like when I learned about the Rockefeller family and their involvement in the education system and the creation of the General Education Board, I was like, that's bad. And then when they're involved with creating the United Nations, that's worse. But then it's like Rockefeller Medicine Men. Have you ever heard of that book by E. Richard Brown?
Yeah.
Rockefeller and the Aspen Institute. Now, Rockefeller was instrumental in creating University of Chicago and giving it a whole bunch of money. That's where Robert Maynard Hutchins was, working on the Great Books of the Western World, which has a whole lot of other British Empire influence coming into that. And then they kind of formulated over here at the Aspen Institute. So what role did you see as far as bringing maybe the Humanist Manifesto forward? How did you see the Aspen Institute playing a role in what you've studied?
It was originally called the Aspen Institute for Humanistic Studies. They changed the name later. I expect they might have gotten some heat for being a religion, which it was, but it was the Aspen Institute for Humanistic Studies. Now it's just the Aspen Institute. There were various members of the Trilateral Commission that were very heavily involved in the Aspen Institute. They didn't create it, but they were heavily involved in it. And that is at the board of directors level. And the board of directors obviously directs the overall thrust of the organization. And the seminars that and conferences that they set up at their headquarters, that's in Colorado, and later at other facilities that they planted around the world, they would involve executives from the top executives, board members, CEOs, vice presidents, and so on of large companies to come and learn a common philosophy, if you will, of business management. Now, not surprisingly, this rested mostly on things like systems theory and the scientific method of running a business. And they spread this philosophy all over the world, all Fortune 5,000 companies. Then they later began to teach middle management the same principles and so on, who later became senior management. And the corporate world has been seeded with this philosophy and this methodology of management ever since. They were horribly influential, I have to say. It's like you can't really appreciate how influential until you see how many people migrated through their programs. And they didn't migrate through as a mandatory thing, like, it wasn't like, well, if you don't go to this, you're fired sort of thing. No, they went to it to network. They went to it to find out the latest ideas on management of a company and so on. And humanistic studies is very much a religious proposition. So, to say that all these corporate engineers and so on are corporate mucky mucks are humanists probably would be an understatement. To call them religious, they would argue that. Well, no, I'm not religious at all. But the Supreme Court even declared that humanism was a religion. So I won't argue with it. It has all the earmarks of it.
Are you familiar with the Reese Committee, where they studied the effect of nonprofit foundations and their influence on America?
Right. Yeah, it's huge. The influence was just huge. If it were not for these large bodies of independent slush fund money, we wouldn't be where we are today. That's just flat out true. Whether it's today in the more modern context, whether it's a Bill Gates or some of the other big billionaires of the world, or whether it's old money like from the Rockefeller family or some of the banking institutions of the world. When they got the ability to set up the NGOs and these independent think tanks and trust funds and so on, and started pumping money into it, it has really been the engine of social change for the last 100 years, very much so. They've had their fingerprints on everything.
It's like if they had 10 fingers and 10 toes in the in the pie. That's not enough. You can't even describe their activities with that. So you've got these foundations. You've got their influence in the university system. You got their influence in grade school and how school comes about. You got their influence over how businesses are being run. They help to create the United Nations, and then they go and create Bretton Woods, the IMF, and World Bank. And this is also running parallel to this idea of technocracy, which they haven't brought back to the surface yet. It's like a submarine. I think I read that someplace. It's like a submarine, and it wasn't visible at that point. But those things were being developed, and then Brzezinski kind of rose and brought it together. How would you describe it in your words?
Well, I think that's the way it did. in Nazi Germany, especially when Hitler nixed the Technocracy organization, they just went, dive, and they went under the water, and they were still there the whole time.
I think there was more than one submarine. Eugenics went under and came up molecular biology. It was like, they just take this little side route, and then we lose their trail. I think at one point it's Agenda 21. No one hears of Agenda 21 because you gave about 10 synonyms for it. How else is Agenda 21 known today as far as what are its synonyms?
Yeah, you've got a number of things that spring from it, and I suppose my identification of technocracy has a lot to do with that. Because you have to look at the bigger picture and how we got here to understand what really is a part and what isn't a part. But the original technocracy documents from the 30s had provisions for what they call functional sequences in governance, not government, governance, the management of society. A functional sequence was some common area in society that needs to be managed by a central authority. Healthcare would be a good example of a functional sequence. Manufacturing would be a functional sequence. Education, they called a service sequence because it wasn't making anything, it was a service provided. But they specified all this stuff originally in the technocracy study course. And education, for instance, is a fundamental part of technocracy. They called it a system of continental conditioning. That was their view of education. Well, I thought education was about learning things and learning how to think critically and reason things out. I said, no, that may be true for you and I, but it wasn't for them. For them, it was just a matter of conditioning. And I'm sure when they wrote that, they were thinking they had Pavlov in mind with his conditioning the animals to drool when they ring a bell. That's really all education to them really was important for. And that's what we see in Common Core today. It's the same kind of thing. It's a system of human conditioning. It's not a system of education. You have smart grid, the idea of putting these meters and stuff on people's and businesses to control the energy that is consumed within those facilities. This is an original specification of technocracy from the 1930s. You have the massive surveillance that's going on today with a total awareness society. This was an original specification from technocracy in the 1930s. You cannot manage what you cannot monitor. That's an engineer's mindset. People need to think like engineers. You can't manage what you cannot monitor. Can't control it. So you have to manage it. Well, what do you need to monitor? Well, I need data. That's what they'll say. Oh, we have to have data. Well, what kind of data do you need? Well, I need everything. How much data is enough? Though there's no such thing. There's never enough data. You always need more data. So what do you need? What kind of data do you need? Well, we need, if it's an economic system we're managing, we need to have all the financial records. We need to know what's in people's minds psychologically, what they want to buy, what they want to do with their lives. We need to have all their health records because, that's important to manage the health of the society. They need all the education records, like Common Core collects 400 data points on students now, becomes a permanent part of their record forever. It'll follow them until they die. And, you have public-private partnerships, which has flavors of fascism in it, but it's not quite, but it's flavors of it. All of these things come from the same source. They were all specified and talked about in the Agenda 21 document that was produced by the Rio Conference. What people just don't get, and they're shocked to find out, is that the United Nations itself says that the Rio Conference was preceded by the Brundtland Commission, which is widely credited by the UN itself as being the foundation stone for the Rio Conference to take place. They point back to the Brundtland Commission. The Brundtland Commission convened in 1982 and it ended in 1987 with the production of a book called Our Common Future. That was the book that staked the claim of sustainable development. They popularized the term. It had been mentioned before, but they were the ones that really brought it to society's lips. And Our Common Future became the book that fueled virtually 100% of the policies that made their way into the Agenda 21 book. What the real conference did was merely to bring together whatever it was, 190 nations from around the world to talk about it and to ratify it. It was kind of a giant consensus meeting, if you will. This is what we've got on the table. What do you think? And so, they got agreement, and a lot of people signed it. President Bush signed some of it himself. Bill Clinton said, I would have signed it all proudly. Fortunately, he wasn't president at the time. He didn't. But what people don't understand is the perverseness of Agenda 21, because Gro Brundtland, the Prime Minister of Norway, ex-Prime Minister of Norway, was a member of the Trilateral Commission from Europe. The question immediately surfaces, is Agenda 21 an off-the-wall United Nations creation, or was it architected, as was NAFTA by Carla Hills, was it architected for other purposes or for us, for the real people of the world? And the answer is obviously not. They architected this for themselves, and the only purpose the Trilateral Commission had in 1982 was to create a new international economic order. That was their stated purpose even then. And so did she play into that, or did she fight against that when she wrote Our Common Future? Duh, of course. She's following the party line, and she's promoting the new international economic order. The United Nations picks it up. The real conference happens. Agenda 21 book is published. The book on biodiversity follows right on its heels. That's the practical implementation of Agenda 21 policies around the world. There was a couple other books that went along with it as well. And so now we have today Sustainable Development / Earth Charter / all this green economy stuff in every corner of the world today. It's everywhere. They've taken it to every nation, to every village, to every district, every county, whatever. And we find it everywhere, but we find its genesis smack dab in the middle of the Trilateral Commission again. This is their creation, it's their baby.
Well, it's also the place where it overlaps with the participation of what I would call the Rothschild Empire, because it's a banking empire, and it was Baron Edmund de Rothschild in 1987 at the UN UNCED conference, where he and Morris Strong.
Morris Strong.
Yeah. It's spelled Maurice, but he says it's Morris. Interesting.
Those guys we'll call him Maurice.
Yeah, I'll just call him Maurice. I'll just ignore it. Just like Morris Greenberg. So you got these characters that they're participating in this United Nations project. But clearly, if you understand the context of where Edmund de Rothschild's coming from, and where his interests lie, you see that this is a group of people who seek to have control, and it's kind of greed run amok, and they're able to make up the rules using such words that it gives them pseudo authority over the world, as long as people believe that. And that's what I think we're trying to get to. It's like these people have created an artificial construct, created these illusions so that we would say, oh yes, Agenda 21, that's the United Nations. We got to listen to that. They also say to disarm the country. And how would the Rockefellers benefit from individuals not being able to defend themselves? What happens then? I mean, what would you get down to? It's always been a struggle for freedom. Freedom and prosperity versus tyranny and slavery, and people trying to plunder that production. So moving forward through that lens, that obviously the bankers have always found it profitable to put people at odds and to fund both sides. The rise of not only Edmund de Rothschild, the elder French banker, but David de Rothschild, who wrote the Agenda 21 kind of handbook to comic book it down for young people. That's the agenda being carried across many generations. I mean, so how would you describe that phenomenon? I mean, is that a hobby to these types of families to say, they just have these projects and we're watching sitcoms? Is that the difference in lifestyle?
I think even the bankers, maybe especially the bankers whose expertise is money. That's That's their claim to fame. They don't make anything otherwise, but they know money. I'm sure they know money pretty well. And I have a feeling that the banking community globally understands that it was never, the way they were architecting it was never meant to be permanent. And that somewhere along the way there was an end to money as they know it. This is kind of hard to get your head around in a way, because you want to say, well, why would somebody like Rockefeller be fighting to destroy capitalism? I mean, isn't that going to destroy him too? Yeah, first of it, you think, well, it certainly would hurt him if he's figuring everything in terms of just money. And I'm sure the central bankers that, people are operating as central banks, families like the banking families, like the Rockefellers, like the Rothschilds and so on. I expect they have a different view of wealth than you and I would. From my perspective, if I had $100,000 in the bank, well, it'd be great. I say, well, I've got some padding, I've got some savings, whatever. And if I get in trouble, I can pull myself through. If I had a few million in the bank, it'd be even better. But money is not a store of, is people call it a store of value, but there is no value in money, you realize. Money can be declared obsolete tomorrow in a heartbeat. Your $1 million is just smoke. It can be burned up in an incinerator in about 5 minutes, and where's your money then? The real value of wealth historically has been in resources of the earth. Everything comes from the earth. All the gold, all the oil, all the the agricultural products, everything that we make has stuff that's taken out of the earth. The lumber that we use to build homes and fuel, fires and stuff and so on around the world. Wood is still the most important fuel for burning, for people to stay warm. And value and wealth is really rooted in the planet, in the earth. And my guess is these people understand this principle pretty well. So it's not just about making money as we used to think, as Sutton and I thought back in the 70s and 80s. It's not just about making money, although they're making money and they're accumulating things along the way. They're certainly a big notch above where we stand. But in the end of it, if wealth is determined on control over resources, then the end game must be to control resources. Not necessarily just have the money, just take away the money and say who actually has their hand on the resources of the world. All around the world today, the United Nations and governments are gobbling up land at a breakneck speed. That's true in the United States. It's true with United Nations heritage designations that are being applied to tracts of land all over the world. The Bureau of Land Management is still gobbling up land like there's no tomorrow. The Nature Conservancy is gobbling up land and selling it to the BLM for a profit. You've got the Park Service, setting land aside essentially under government control, closing off the gates so nobody can get into it, whatever. And people think, well, that's just for the save the environment. That's nonsense. It's to save the resources to take the resources offline, to make the resources scarce, so that when the oligarchy, if you will, sets up that global trust one day, the resources of the world are going to be placed in that global trust for the common good. Here kind of back to hold-ons again in a way. You can't be trusted with private property because you would do selfish things. Well, you might cut down all the trees on your property or whatever. You might dig a water well that consumes too much water out of planet Earth, whatever. You can't be trusted with resources, but somehow they can. So in the end of it, if you can picture the technocracy world of the future, energy will be controlled so that people must do what they have energy available to do. The resources of the world where everything is drawn out of will be licensed to people like you and I through a permit process where we might be able to scratch out a living on a corner of land somewhere as a farmer. We might be a miner, we might be an oil driller, whatever, and we may or may not get licenses to do anything. This is essentially like the feudal system in the Dark Ages where the land barons owned everything and you had to squat on a piece of ground. If the guy liked you, he'd let you stay and farm out, maybe raise some hogs or something, and you'd give him 80% of what you made and you get the balance to keep your family alive if you could. This control over resources is clearly where everything is moving today. This is what sustainable development is all about. Twisting the resources out of the hands of the people and putting it into the hands of the elite. That's the scam in the simplest terms that I can describe. Getting the resources away from you and me and putting it into the hands of a global trust organization. They never say who the trustees are going to be. History tells us exactly who it's going to be. It's going to be the people that set up the system. In other words, whoever implements technocracy is going to be the ones worthy to be the trustees of all the resources of the world. They haven't helped the world.
You were discussing the feudalistic concept and how it existed in Europe. What put an end to it? I mean, why don't we live in I'm sorry about that. Why don't we live into that environment today? What's the difference between America and Europe?
Well, Europe was not always under the oppression of the European Union like they have today. Europe has always been a group of nations that didn't get along very well together, but they were typically still very nationalistic and proud of their nationality. The system of the general theory of liberty took at least 300 years to develop since the feudal society. It was a slow process. There were a number of people that came along during that time to write treatises of one kind or another about the value of liberty, the value of freedom, the value of self-determination, and so on. All of those documents historically, many of which came from Great Britain, by the way, those documents ended up in the culmination of our founding documents of the Declaration of Independence and our Constitution. All of that thinking went into it. We have, one of the reasons that we have the expression of liberty and freedom that we've had in our country is specifically because of those 300 or 400 years of influence to get to where we could even write the Constitution. It's a very slow, drawn-out process. I said in context of technocracy, if technocracy wins this battle and they implement it on a global basis, it will again take hundreds of years before, at least hundreds of years before the concept of freedom and liberty will surface again. It will take a very long time, maybe much longer than before. But it won't just come snapping back, and it's not going to be like, well, it's a fad, and they'll do it for 4 or 5 years, and then we'll go back to doing what we want to do. No, once they get control of the economic mechanism, they will have control virtually over life itself, and they'll be able to make the peoples of the world dance like puppets on a string.
It reminded me of that H.G. Wells book, The Shape of Things to Come, that was made into Things to Come, the movie. And the movie is more powerful, in my opinion, than the book, because a lot of those things ended up being developed. And I don't want to harp on H.G. Wells. I want to move back into Brzezinski. Now that you've described freedom and how it evolved very slowly and painfully out of feudalism, what does Brzezinski's book, Between Two Ages, America in the Technocratic Era, what is the Technocratic Era, and what is he trying to take us back to or take us out of?
Well, he's trying to take us forward through the stepping stones of Marxism to arrive at this Technocratic era. And I'll say up front, openly, that Brzezinski has been charged with being a Marxist or a communist many times over the years. But if you read his book, you will find out he never was a Marxist. He didn't say that Marxism was a good thing per se, but what he did say is merely a stepping stone, a necessary stepping stone to get to the fourth and final stage of what he calls societal evolution. Remember, he's a political scientist. He talks in weird terms, but he talks about societal evolution has gone through these stages, these maturing process. Marxism was simply just one of those stepping stones, and we had to have it. But we have to get through it. And when we get through it, what we'll end up is with what he described as his technocratic era, and essentially that would be something very comparable to technocracy that we're talking about, where everything is managed by an elite, where technology is used to do the managing, In that sense, by the way, it's important to differentiate between a personal dictator, like you had, well, even like you had Adolf Hitler, or you had Nero, and in Rome. There were dictators where, if he said off with your head, well, your head was gone. That was just that simple. What the technocratic era does is it creates a system of control, not controlled necessarily by an individual, but the system is the controller of society. And this is what we see, this is what technocracy is all about, applying systems theory to sociological engineering, so that rules and regulations are put in place to be enforced by technology that will keep you in a channel that they want to keep you in. I use the example of go to your bank and try and get more than $300 out of the ATM machine. They just flat out won't do it. It'll tell you your daily limit is $300. And you say, but I've got $100,000 in the bank. I want my money. Oh, sorry, can't get out of this ATM. You could go down the street to another branch of your bank and you put your card in. It knows you drew out the other one. It's going to say, oh, you already taken out your daily limit. Sorry, bub. And if you go inside the bank and ask for the teller just to give you some money, first she'll ask you what you want the money for. You say, it's none of your business. I want my money. If you get past that argument, she'll say, well, we really only have $3,000 in cash in our bank at any one time anymore. And that's true. The banks are not carrying cash anymore for large withdrawals. And so she will say something like, well, we can get the money here, but we'll have to call an armored truck and get it ordered in from another regional bank, and it may take anywhere from 3 days to 2 weeks to get that kind of money here. You say, well, I would really count on getting my money today. I thought I could just draw it out. You can't. See, regulations have been put in place that block you from doing stuff like that. And this is what's going to happen in the future in an increasing manner. Another good example I like to use in terms of carbon footprint is that once smart meters are in place and monitoring the power consumption of everybody's home, imagine your carbon footprint in your home being matched to things like, for instance, the no-fly list. Right now, it just consists of terrorists and stuff. People who they say are many people. I remember one time there was a 5-year-old child that was on a no-fly list. He said, "How the heck did that happen?" The kid never was nothing.
He must not have paid his taxes.
Must have done something wrong. Yeah, but if you can imagine that you're kind of independent on your power usage, and so you use maybe 20% more than your neighbors just because you got the money, you can buy the power, whatever. But you go to buy a plane ticket to maybe to go visit somebody in Los Angeles, maybe somebody died in your family or whatever. I'm going to go to the funeral. And so you go online and make your plane reservation, and you put in your information or whatever, and it goes processing, and all of a sudden a screen pops up and says you're disallowed to buy the plane ticket. And you say, why? And it says you have exceeded your carbon footprint by 20%. You see, and if you fly on that airplane, why, you're really going to go over. So we're going to put you back in line. Now, after the first of the next month, if you're good for the rest of this month, if you're on point, then next month you're welcome to buy a plane ticket to go to Los Angeles. See, that kind of thing is very plausible in the future, the way this thing is going. Al Gore even said just a few weeks ago, talking about climate change, as he always does, he called everybody that doesn't believe like him a denier. And he says deniers deserve to be punished. That's what he said. He used the word punished. That's a dangerous thought for any American to say, that if you don't believe like somebody else, you deserve to be punished just because you don't believe that way. But see, this mentality is hooked into the mindset of technocrats. This is the way they think. If you don't believe the way they believe and do what they say, you deserve to be punished. So let me count the ways how I can punish you.
Well, and it's no different than Brave New World. The managerial class is exempt from the rules. They can have art and they can have access to this occulted information. And in 1984, obviously O'Brien has access to whatever he wants.
Right.
And it's a form of caste system. It's a knowledge, power, wealth gap. It's the same. It's a new flavor on how they've been ruling people for thousands of years.
That's right.
Right.
That's right. And now the system will do the ruling. The system will do the managing. And of course, that was a major theme in Brave New World. The system did everything. And if you didn't like the way the system was, well, hey, it's the system, man.
It's the state.
You can't change the system.
And Huxley made it clear there was no parents. The first scene in the movie, first chapter in the book, is the breeding room where they're putting them together through the machines and stuff. And it's like, wait a minute, what happens when you have no parents? Oh, everyone's just brought up by the state. I mean, these are ideas that I'm sure were on the cusp of other tyrants, minds back in the day, but they never got them written down. You've got families like the Medicis, who are a great banking influential family. They had Machiavelli. So the Rockefellers, they had already collected Henry Kissinger. They said, hey, Brzezinski, I like that idea you got there. Something to that. And at the 1972 Bilderberg meeting, David Rockefeller and Brzezinski are there. And what happened?
Well, they simply went over there to bounce the idea of founding the Trilateral Commission off their buddies. And they got a lot of encouragement. I couldn't tell you specifically who encouraged them, but that's what Rockefeller later said.
Yeah.
That they got a lot of favorable comments and stuff, enough so they came back and actually founded the Trilateral Commission. And I'm sure that some of the people in that Bilderberg meeting were actually invited to join the Trilateral Commission. That mostly would have been the European component, probably, because the Bilderbergs met in Europe. There were some Americans there as well. Probably people like Henry Kissinger there, for instance. He was an early member of the Trilateral Commission. So there would have been some Americans as well. My guess is Rockefeller already talked to some of them about, hey, if I start this, would you join? Become one of the charter members, if you will. I'll point out, however, that they never did have an application process. You don't apply to become a member of this group. It's run like a fraternity, where you have pledge week, so to speak, and everybody goes to the parties, and you hope, if you want to get into a particular fraternity, you hope somebody from that fraternity comes up and taps you on the shoulder and says, "Come with me," and then they put you through rush week to actually join, or a candidating process to join the fraternity. That's the way it is. They have an executive committee that meets and discusses who they want to invite to be members. And you obviously are identified as a 100% game player, on their side before you're invited to join. Otherwise, I'm sure they can invite you to go disjoin. It's like get out. If you turn against them, you're probably not going to last. But this process has been used since day one, and the Trilateral Commission itself has written about that, and that's their standard procedure for inducting new members.
How did Jimmy Carter come to be president through the Trilateral Commission?
Later, after the Carter presidency, Brzezinski himself wrote that it was he who picked Jimmy Carter as a candidate early on. There was some risk in it, I suppose, that somebody else could have gotten the presidency, but he did. And Brzezinski became the first NSA, the National Security Advisor. But Brzezinski bragged about educating Carter and everything that he needed to know about foreign policy and about the economic policy of the world, which was administered through the State Department primarily. And Carter and Mondale both were members of the Trilateral Commission by the time they ran for office. Carter came into office as being the poor boy peanut farmer from Georgia. Aw shucks, ma. Not knowing anybody in Washington, he said, "Oh, I'm so disconnected. I don't know what I'll do." And most importantly, he said, "I'll never lie to you." He said that was a big campaign promise. "I'll never lie to you." I don't think he ever told the truth. In fact, that's all he could do is lie, kind of like somebody else I know in a modern context, but won't mention any names. But Carter immediately proceeded to appoint members of the Trilateral Commission to his cabinet, to top State Department posts. And at one point, he had almost 1/3 of the entire U.S. membership involved in his administration.
That's a lot of people.
Talk about undue influence.
Yeah.
Well, considering there's only I think about 90 people from the United States in the commission at that time, 1/3 is a lot. And at one point, all but one member of his cabinet was not a member of the Trilateral Commission. All the rest of them were. So immediately, the Trilateral Commission had undue influence in the executive branch, and it wouldn't have mattered what organization they came from, I suppose. If they had come from the YMCA, I would have been concerned. It's like, wait a minute, that's statistically impossible. If you're picking people just kind of from society in general, you can't come up with that many people from the same narrow organization. I don't care who they are. And the fact that they had an established agenda was even of greater concern. And here you have an international group meeting in plenary sessions to hammer out policies. And they vote on the policies that they're going to take back to their respective countries. And then this group from America comes back and implements these policies in our country without any public involvement whatsoever, without the involvement of Congress, and they just do it. It's like, what gives them the right to do this? See, this was a hijacking, literally, of the American government, of the executive branch. But it was not a political coup, even though it involves a political system. You say, why did they want control of the executive branch of the American government? Well, the executive branch was the mover, shaker, and driver of the global economy. Period. We were the superpower. And there was no country that had the influence that we had on global economics and global policy other than the United States. They wanted to get control of that engine of economic process so that they could create their new international economic order. That was their stated purpose. The United States government machinery allowed them to do that. And the evidence now, looking backwards, is so overwhelming on how they did it. For instance, the first USTR was appointed by Jimmy Carter in 1977. There have been 12 USTRs since then. 9 of them have been members of the Trilateral Commission, appointed by the president at the time. 9 out of 12 have been members, including the current one, Michael Froman, who's negotiating the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a member of the Trilateral Commission. Jimmy Carter, Barack Obama appointed Froman. And, you have like the World Bank. There have been 8 bank presidents that appointed by our president of the World Bank. The World Bank is undeniably the engine of global economic transformation. These people have been nefarious, horrible some of the stuff they've done over the decades. But out of 8 World Bank presidents appointed by our president, 6 of them have been members of the Trilateral Commission. Well, how does this come about? You see, it wasn't about political control. It's about economic control. They were going to transform America in the process, but it wasn't about America. It was about the rest of the world. And so you see their influence in things like the USTR, the World Bank, through the intelligence establishment, and so on. Like the National Security Advisor and so on. The NSA, by the way, is a position in government. He's the gatekeeper to the president. Personally, I think it's the second most powerful position in the government, because he's able to limit information as well as give information to the president. So if you have somebody that has an agenda to hide, deceive, or whatever, the NSA is the one that has the ability to do it. And so, we see over a period of time, the NSAs, I think there's been 17 of them since Carter. Out of 17, 10 of them have been members of the Trilateral Commission. That's statistically impossible if you just figure they're going to pick it out of 300 million people in our country.
It says they want to control that gate.
Yes.
That gateway.
That's right. They want to control that mechanism. So they've had domination of the economic machinery that's been used to transform the world towards this system of technocracy.
What happens to trilateral members if they join the United States government?
Well, they put them on a holding list. They say this is actually on their membership list. They say former members in public service. And after they're done with public service, then they just go back on the main list again, by and large. So yeah, it's kind of a sham. I mean, they all, if you question any of them in office, they would say, oh, well, nobody that's in office can belong to the Trilateral Commission. So they just put them on another part of their list, former members in public service. But they don't have any association, you understand, while they're in public office. It's pretty thin.
What's the difference between a Trilateral Commission and an ISIS training camp? Well, Al Qaeda.
Yeah,
sorry.
Yeah. In one sense, there's not a lot of difference, but still, it's the idea is a few people taking their ideas and shoving it down other people's throat.
Can you tell me a little bit about the trilateral publication, The Crisis in Democracy?
Wow, specifically?
It doesn't have to be specific, just its role in history, because it was one of the early papers floated out there.
Specifically, it's been a long time since I reviewed Crisis in Democracy, but the effect that it had was that that democracy as a political institution was outdated and it needed to be replaced. They didn't say exactly how it would be replaced, but Brzezinski wrote about this in his book Between Two Ages too. He said that the nation state is really being controlled by actors that are the banks and the banksters and the multinational corporations, not the Congress made up of 600 odd people. And these people really believe that democracy and that the republic form of government was completely outmoded for the coming technotronic era. And that was one book that just chipped away at those foundations. And we still see the same philosophy today. Nation state is bad. If you're a kind of a nation stater today, why you're likely to be labeled a nativist. That's the term of derision for people who well, you're a nativist. Well, what the heck, what does that mean? Well, I don't know. I'm a native here, I guess.